Cool. Well, today I'll be sharing conversational space with 4 Bay Area Asian community leaders who have different perspectives on whether or not the police should be involved to prevent and address anti-Asian violence. Since the start of the pandemic, we have all witnessed a frightening increase in violence within our communities, particularly within Oakland and San Francisco Chinatown. And this witnessed increase in race-based violence is not new in the Bay. South Asian and Sikh communities also face high rates of discrimination and violence following 9/11, similarly bearing the brunt of misplaced blame for a national crisis. All of our Asian communities in the Bay have a similar goal of wanting to prevent and stop further violence from occurring, but as said, we have different perspectives on whether or not the police should be involved in this. Some have called for increases in police funding, while others are against this call, noting that increased police presence does not actually deter crime and could bring harm to our Bay Area Black community members. As we know, the Asian community is not a monolith. We are coming from different ethnicities, cultural contexts, ages, experiences, intersections of identity, and so much more. We were inherently connected to one another as members of the Asian diaspora in the Bay Area, whether we like it or not. We share space here, we share society, we are neighbors, which is why it's important for us to which is why it's important for us to gather and get to the roots of why these different perspectives on policing have taken shape. Before we dive into the conversation, I do want to say that this is not going to be an easy conversation. It's going to be risky. As you'll come to learn, each of our speakers today has their own unique and very personal perspective and experiences within Asian violence and the police, and it is likely that tension will arise. But the goal of this conversation is not to have a debate or convince one another on whether or not the police should be involved to address anti-Asian violence in the Bay. The goal is to make space for an honest conversation between our speakers coming from different backgrounds in order to bridge with one another and gain a deeper understanding why their fellow speakers hold certain beliefs. So we're asking everyone, including the audience, to approach these conflicts with confidence, compassion, and really follow-up questions to get to the root of people's positions. And with that, I'd like to turn it to our speakers for the first round of questions and round of introductions. Sammy, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. Can you briefly introduce yourself and then tell us, what does safety mean to you and your community? And what is you and your community's relationship to the police?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Evan. And hi, everyone. My name is Sammy Ablaza Wills. I use they, them pronouns. I am a Filipino-American, non-binary trans person. I have kind of wavy hair. I'm wearing gold hoops and I have a silk teal shirt on. I'm really excited to join this conversation today. From my own experience, as I mentioned, as a trans and Filipinx person, and also as the director of APINC, I work with transgender and non-binary Asian and Pacific Islander people from across the Bay Area to build safe communities, to develop ourselves as leaders, and to heal from our ancestral and present day traumas. And so at APINC and in my communities more broadly, we talk a lot about what safety means to us. And I think most plainly, safety for us is connection. It is the capacity and the space to heal. It is the ability to get our basic needs like food and housing and security met so that all of us do not have to live a life rooted in fear. We can live a life rooted in abundance and interdependence instead. And in terms of how our community relates to police, I think police are very contentious for our people and oftentimes do not make our people feel more safe because there is such a high degree of police violence against transgender folks, against working class people, and against folks of color. Many times people in our community feel less safe by police presence. And recently, APINC finished up a survey of over 200 trans and non-binary API people in the Bay Area, the largest of any survey of our community that's ever happened. And out of the 200 participants, only one person said that they felt very safe with police. And so when I think about my own experience, and when I also think about what my people are telling me, it feels very loud and clear. And so I'm holding that close in this conversation, and I'm really grateful to be here with everyone.
Thank you so much, Sammy. Would you mind sharing next?
Yes, Happy New Breath, everyone. My name is Zhang. I'm the founder of the New Breath Foundation. I use he, him pronouns. I'm on lonely land, Oakland, California. And I'm wearing a red kind of hoodie with a gray, like a short sleeves sweater and short hair. I'm Chinese American. And I have a bookshelf behind me full of knowledge that I've gained during my 21 years of incarceration. And safety for me is to be able to address the intergenerational trauma that was inflicted by white supremacy, by the institutional racism that who committed the first harm in the genocide of the Native Americans, and the second harm on the kidnapping and enslavement of the African Americans. As a Chinese American, my community that I interact with and build with and live with want to feel safe by having equitable housing, food, jobs, mental health care, and also we want to be for the people that I interact with, we want to have racial solidarity. My relationship and the community's relationship with the police is adversarial and friendly relationship. Adversarial because the history of the police from the slave catchers is to institutionalize a police oppressive force. And because of its establishment, it has always inflicted and perpetuated harm for generations. Friendly because since they do exist, myself and my community do work with the police because as an institution, sort of oppressive force, they're also human beings. And so they are also doing what they can as individuals to try to do what they can to perform the act of creating public safety. But for me, safety is covering all the basic needs for all people.
Thank you, Eddie. Carl, to you.
Good afternoon, good morning for everyone. Because I know some of you are from the East Coast. My name is Chen. I am the president of the Oakland Chinatown Chamber of Commerce, but I started young as a little kid, serving at Asian Health Services, which will grow from a one-room clinic to now that we're serving about 30,000, patients in the low-income families, and we're also offering 14 languages. For all the families, but basically, I pronounce he or him, and for me, Oakland Chinatown is basically my second home. Interesting enough, when we talk about the police, depending on the age and whether they're younger generation or the older generation, just like Eddie, we're very involved with the police, and then for Oakland Chinatown specifically. Most of the residents, over 70% of them, or even 80% of them are seniors. And the businesses are basically catering for also pretty low income families. And so basically for the elderly, they wish to see more police presence as a protection. But for the younger generation, they may not always see the same way. So it's also for mostly people coming to patronizing and shopping in Chinatown, in Oakland Chinatown, people want to see more police because they feel more safe with the police. But again, I think this is going to be something that we all need to be talking about today as a main topic. But depending on which community we are in, I understand how other communities may not want to see a police presence, but at least that I know in Oakland, Chinatown, they want to see more police as a basic protection. Thank you.
Deep?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Sat Sri Akal. My name is Nandip Singh. I'm the executive director of the Jakarta movement. I use he, him pronouns. I am a cishet identifying Sikh male. I have a rust-colored shirt on this morning with wearing a black badna, which is a smaller turban, and have a, I don't know, a little bit past my about to my sternum length of beard, and I guess that's what I'm wearing this morning, and very excited to join all of you and take part in a really important conversation, very apropos conversation for this time and place. You know, I think around the question of safety, I think safety to me is to be able to live a life of dignity. And it's tied to many of the things that some of my co-panelists shared in terms of making sure your needs are met. But I think it is something to be able to bring your whole self each and every day to the areas, to the spaces you inhabit, to the places you shop, to the places you bring, to the places you congregate, to the places you socialize with, without any inhibition. And you know, I think we're having an important conversation in terms of does the police or do that sort of authoritative forces have a role to play in the fostering of that? And I think within the Sikh community, this has been sort of a very deep conversation. I would say there are differences based on positionality. I think there are huge differences based on immigration status. There's huge differences based on class. There's huge differences based on gender. There's huge differences based on sexuality. So this is a conversation that tugs very close to my heart, because I've been part of a number of forums where you know, this conversation is most had. In terms of the Jakarta movement work in the Bay Area, we work overwhelmingly with youth. We have chapters on 9 different high school campuses in the Bay Area, with a concentration especially in the East Bay, the Fremont, Union City, Hayward areas. And I think even being located in working class families like that also gives you a very different perspective. And so, you know, I'm eager, you know, in terms of this conversation to sort of flesh out what that looks like. I can definitely share in terms of with the youth we work with, they do not necessarily feel safe with a police presence, and oftentimes it's just based on their own experiences, or even where elders in our community have called sometimes for more policing and a larger police presence, especially in certain neighborhoods and certain areas. More often than not, it has actually led to greater arrests of the youth in those neighborhoods from oftentimes the same community that they were trying to seek to protect. And so I think there is an intergenerational conversation to be had. And I think, you know, we're going to be talking at the interstices of a lot of different levels, you know, as we share today.
Thank you so much, Deep, and thank you everyone for sharing. A lot of, in a way, I'm hearing some similarities in how we think about safety, in the sense that it means having dignity, it means access to basic services, it means being able to live as your full self. But then what comes to question is the idea of police, and whether or not police give us safety, they can provide safety in a sense. And yeah, and I think that's where I'm seeing the divide here. I guess the next question I have for you all, and feel free whoever wants to start first, is what assumptions do you hold towards those in your community, in the Bay Area, Asian community broadly, who have called for or are against, depending on where you stand on this topic, more police funding in the face of increasing violence? And anyone who wants to, feel free to jump in.
Go. For me, with all the anti-Asian violence that has been happening in the Bay Area and across the nation and globally, for that matter, because of from the government, from imperialists, for the right wings, there is fear in our community, right? Because of all the violence that's been happening. But those violence, as we know, they have been happening, but they haven't been really magnified in the international media, right? That catch attentions of people to understand, as what you framed it, Evan, at the beginning, that we are not a monolithic group, right? And however, because of those fear of the individual being victimized, especially our elders and our women being victimized, their instant call for police and surveillance to feel safe is understandable. And there is a role, right, in a way that feel safe and having a better understanding of what safety really means. Is it safety after the fact, or is it them from being harmed at the first place, right? And so when people are calling for more law enforcement, where we already know through data and statistics that the law enforcement has not been creating safety, sometimes perpetuating more harm in our community, we knew that the investment heavily, solely in law enforcement, prison, industry complex has never been the answer. So if we know that, that's why we're advocating for more resources to be diverted to our educational institutions, to our healthcare institutions, to alternative to incarceration, to restorative justice, right? To culturally competent educations such as ethnic studies, Asian American studies, gender studies, right? Global studies. And so therefore, I feel that we have not done so when we continue to resort that the only solution to feel safe, the only way to feel safe is to have more law enforcement being present. And so, again, I want to finish by saying that we have to understand, like, our history that informs our value so we can humanize each other. That we need to invest in tapping into that chi that I just expressed, right? Or else, then we're always going to be at odds with each other about what should happen in our community, whether it's more police or less police, when we don't even address the systemic perpetuation of those intergenerational harm.
Maybe I can also chime in a little here. So basically, when we are talking about defunding the police or to reform, so in our community, we definitely want to see reform. Reform, there are many ways to reform, okay? And number one, we're talking about the police department. First things first, it's about hiring. Who we are hiring as police officers. We're hiring from our own community who will understand the needs of each community. But we also need to provide trainings, necessary trainings, so that the police officers will understand what racism is all about, what each community is facing, and why they do not like police, or why some communities, they feel that they are welcome or not being welcome. But I think the other most important things about the third item that I want to talk about, the reform of the police department, is promotion. Are we just hiring, each race or from each community? Are they being promoted to be the leadership position, so that to have the training, necessary training, and to have all these necessary reforms? But I also want to talk about defunding the police. I know there are certain cities or county or state. The reason why they're doing defunding, not necessarily they're trying to do reform, because they are facing a budget crisis. So they're calling it defunding because they have issue dealing with the money. in terms of the budget. Now, I also want to talk about the prevention portion of it. So people are saying that more police does not help to prevention. I have to argue, say it's not true, because some of you may have seen many incidents about AAPI hate, especially during the month of I would say August or in July, and once the budget was cut about the police, so we have less police presence in Oakland, Chinatown. Guess what? All the crimes spiked quickly, and then also until there are a couple of times when there's actually shooting in Chinatown and hurting someone, then we're calling for more police presence. So since the increase of police presence in Oakland, Chinatown in the beginning of August, we almost have almost zero, that's not totally zero, incidents in Chinatown. But before that, it's almost a daily occurrence, many incidents for each day. By saying that, the most important thing is like, how are we going to be using the money in terms of the reform? Now, let's use another example, because I know people are so not liking to talk about the police. So let's talk about the school as a different example. If let's say there's a school, they have bad teachers or they're not doing well, are we going to be shut down the entire police or defunding the school? Or shall we put more resources to revitalize the school? Okay, so I think as a school, we may say, because we're serving the kids, so why don't we hire better teachers and better training so that the school will do better, so that we don't need to shut it down, and so that they can continue to provide the basic necessary educations to all kids. They need this education. So by saying that, I think it's important to do the reform, but not necessarily to do the defunding of the police department.
Thank you, Carl. Sammy, would you like to respond?
I'll go, I guess, first, and then would love to hear Sammy's comments. I think when we look at like certain sort of statistics, I think even for myself, I think it's also important to like understand sort of like what are causes and what are also just correlations. So what we have noticed throughout the United States, actually in many parts of the world, is an increase in certain types of criminality. That is very, very much sort of objectively that has occurred during this period of the pandemic. Now, has that occurred because there has been a decrease in policing? Actually, if we actually look at what most studies are showing, it actually talks about is the ways that our social bonds were actually decreased during this period. And I grew up. I was a child of the '90s, where that sort of war on crime, war on drugs was very much sort of the talk, and where this sort of stop and frisk type of policing, this sort of broken window policing became very much sort of how many urban area communities, especially in the Bay Area, but in others as well, thought would be how you bring this under control. What's interesting to show is statistically, they can't even show that it actually made much of a difference, which is strange, because one would assume intuitively that if there's a larger presence, people would be more fearful, and there would be less of these kind of incidences. Most actually scholars believe it actually has to do with other things, whether that be lead in the water, lead exposure, many other actually things. And so, but what's fascinating is when I actually look at even incidences that are recorded in the 90s, and that for today in the 2020s, it is much, much lower today. But the way we discuss these things, I would actually almost argue there's even more of a heightened fear amongst parents, amongst especially dependent on sort of class position. There's actually even more of a fear today, even though statistically, a lot of these are actually in a much different place than they were even, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. So how do we sort of rectify these things? I think there is I honestly think in our society there is some sort of there's a pathology. It's some sort of sickness where we live in such fear of our neighbors, such fear of of those around us that may be different. If we're actually going to have safety and dignity, we really have to think about not just some authoritative party governing our interactions and relations with each other, but what are going to be what is our responsibilities, what are our duties, what actually binds us together in the communities that we live in. So what does that mean in Oakland? What does that mean in Union City? What does that mean in Hayward? What does that mean in Alameda? And I think those are the conversations that really, and those are the ones that the young people want to have. I mean, like those are the kind of conversations we want to have. And I think if we're really going to move the needle and create a Bay Area that's inclusive for all, where we feel safety, where we feel dignity, then it's going to be much more about certain conversations about how we treat each other, how we live with each other, and what sort of cultures we're creating on our community. And very much, if we're going to talk about certain sort of hate crimes or hate incidences, I think there's much to be said about what is to Carl's point, what is the culture on our school campuses as well? Because more often than not, those even become sort of breeding points. So I think, if we're only talking about increasing police force, I think we're really sort of missing sort of the fundamental issues of how we live and how we connect and how we build the Bay Area together.
Thank you for that. I'm truly buzzing with like so many things that I want to say, inspired by you all. But one story, like one anecdote, is really sticking out to me in this moment, and it comes from one of my community elders who grew up and was raised and spent a majority of her life in San Francisco, Chinatown. And she talked about how growing up as a young Chinese lesbian, every time she would walk in San Francisco Chinatown and cross over to the North Beach side, there would be groups of white boys ready there to like enact violence on her or hurt her or call her tons of racist, sexist, and homophobic names, right? Like pick from the variety. And how in response to that, her and other friends who also identified like in their early ages as young Chinese lesbians came together to walk one another around. So if they ever needed to walk into North Beach, they had each other to keep each other safe, right? They had safety in numbers. And the thing that I'm taking from that, and the thing that I've taken from that for many years, is really just the necessity of protection, right? Like for a lot of people, I don't think what they're looking for is like an eye for an eye. A lot of people want to feel safety and protection in the places that they call home. And oftentimes the way that protection comes about is through peers. It's through people that see them and understand them, showing up physically, emotionally, and materially to make that change happen and to make that walk a little bit more safe. And I think when I think about the issue of policing, I also really think about that scenario, right? Because her inclination was not to call the police, but it was to ask other people in her community who she feels much safer with. And this person is in her 70s now. She still lives in the Bay Area. She's still in Chinatown all the time. And when we talk about the intergenerationality of this, I also think it's important to name that for many folks who are queer and trans of all ages, they have known from a very, very young age that policing wasn't the thing that provided protection, community was. So how are we investing in community resources that show up for one another, that provide us that culturally relevant, that sexuality affirming, that gender affirming protection that, you know, theoretically and literally brings us across the street?
There's so much just percolating. You know, there's like never enough time to, you know, just capsulate everything. But my thought is, you know, when we're talking about the power of storytelling, you know, Sammy just demonstrated, you know, one of the millions of examples, you know, why people feel unsafe and how they feel safe and what solution they want to create, right? And spirit of storytelling, I do want to share that, you know, education, right? It's a huge investment, you know, in across the board, right? And so, because as I was growing up, I'm sure many of all of us, our parents all emphasize the importance of education. But however, if the investment does not match with all the slogans and with all the good intentions, and the institution of education is not really providing adequate resources that rooted in, you know, this really the goal of collective liberation, right? Do this growing up process, then we have to start questioning how the school to prison pipeline, right, has continued to happen in our Black and brown community. And then, as we have witnessed over the last 3 decades, the steady increase of the Asian American Pacific Islanders who are also impacted by the school to prison pipeline, right? Where a lot of investment is on the prison industry complex, on the ICE, right, the Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, to not only to put people on this pipeline, but then also to create the separation of family, right, from people. And that's where people don't feel. And so, I mean, I think this conference really demonstrates the fact that when we're talking about the immigrant populations or Asian Americans or the Mensa community, right, the Arab Middle Eastern, the Salvation communities, it's that sense of being as others, right? So when I was incarcerated as a Chinese, as an Asian, they break down, they racially segregate us, right? Either Black, white, Hispanic, or other. So we just become part of that other. And so othering, this sense of immigrants and refugees, people coming here wanting to find a place of belonging, it's always been that struggle, right? When we're living in a capitalistic and imperialistic society that is all about profit and it's not about investing in human beings. And I think that's essentially what we're talking about here, is how do we make sure there's adequate resources to invest in human beings and the social safety nets so we don't have to experience those type of institutional harm and individual harm, because the institution perpetuate those intergenerational traumas, hence hurt people, right? So how do we create a culture of heal people? And I think that's something that I learned as someone who inflicted harm, right, as a 16-year-old to a family of 4 in San Francisco when I committed my crime of home invasion robbery, that I was charged as an adult and sentenced to life in prison, right? But it was investment in education, but it's also community members who never gave up on me and wanted to invest in me, that allowed me the opportunity to heal and take responsibility for my actions and start really understand my purpose, right? So I think in that process, I feel that we have to, again, you know, when Nadeep was talking about how do we understand, you know, the origin, right? And understand that how those impacts, you know, in our community, from young people all the way to our elders.
You know,
Thank
I
you.
think I'm so glad, you share,
One second, sorry, yeah, to respond. I think this falls in line with the follow-up reply. I also had a follow-up question on there. There are concerns about the efficacy of police as deterrent to crimes, and concerns that increased policing will bring harm to Black community members. And responding to Eddie, maybe as a follow-up to this as well, how do you address these fears that Asian and neighboring community members have towards increased policing? But respond however you like as well too. Sorry.
Well, I think so. I think one thing we all share in common is that racism does exist, and we all know what racism is all about for some of us. And people saying that I understand racism, I have to say this. I think some people will try to understand racism, but unless you are the receiving end, people may not truly understand what racism is all about. So I think we're all learning from each other and also from each community. And as we know that the Black community have suffered the most in terms of racism, at the beginning of forming of this country, and we have to understand how we can deal with racism, and this is also part of the reason why we also talk about the police reform, and then that's the reason why people are also talking about the defunding of the police. So there are many. I think we're always focusing so many things on the problems, but I think we also need to focus on the solutions. And I know some of you talk about some short-term solutions and also long-term solutions. And idealistically, we can do so many things, but we also need to face the reality. And when we're also talking about Black and Brown community, many of us actually work with the all these communities, not only AAPI community, but I myself also work with the Black and Brown community and also the Jewish community, and all of those, they are suffering because of racism. But I think the whole issue, I know Eddie did talk about incarceration, people being put in jail, but also talk to many people in the Black and Brown community. This is also what we need to look at. The legal system. I think we're all only focusing about the police. We also forgot about the legal system itself. And for those who have been imprisoned, but before they release or after they release, what kind of resources being provided so that these people will not be getting the wrong track again, because they need help, they need resources to go back to their own community. Now we are also facing another issue in terms of people are talking about the Black community. Now, I know many of you were saying that, oh, the Black community don't want police. But when they're truly talking to all these people in the community, actually they do also want police, especially just like us in the Asian community, especially in Chinatown community, the elderly. They want to see more police for protection, okay? But again, the long-term solution, like Eddie and some of you are saying, education. I think education is so important. We have to understand, and people have to understand what racism is all about through education. And we got to start them young, in school, in workplace, in the social media, okay? And also in politics, because, we are so divided, especially in the higher up government and the former president, and also talk about division, dividing us. So I think in the long-term solution, we have to talk about how we should be working together and finding solutions. And sometimes we may not agree in everything, but there are many common, there are many things that we can agree with. So let's start with those. I think that's very important. Now I know that many people trying to be very politically correct, and I have tried it for a long, long time. So I have to tell myself, and people always telling me, you may not always be politically correct. I think that's fine, okay? And don't be afraid to speak out, and don't be afraid to talk about race. And one of the I will call her the public servant, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, is someone I have a lot of respect, because over 30 years ago, she told us, all of us, the Asian, Hispanic, Black, and all communities together. They're saying that when there are crises, all races, minorities were pitting against each other, fighting among each other, and we don't see the big picture. So I think when we are facing the pandemics, and especially for Asian AAPI community, we are facing a dual pandemic. Not only the regular pandemic we're facing, we're also facing the AAPI hate. So something that we have been dealing with every single day. So I agree with many of you by providing many of the solutions. But for a short-term solution, it may not be the only solution, and is to getting the basic protection that we want. Okay, and I know other communities may not want to see a police presence, but at least I know that in my community, in the Chinatown community, they do want to see police presence at this very moment, until we can find a better way to solve the public safety issue. So with that said, I just want us to also focusing how we can work with other community. Now, recently I was able to work with the Black community faith-based leaders, and we are talking about how we can bring public safety to our city together. And next week I'll be also supporting the Jewish community, because the anti-Semitism is happening. So there are many racisms that we're all facing. So I think we need to work together by finding solutions, not only focusing on the problems itself.
Thank you, Carl. Deeper Sammy, would you like to respond already?
Yeah, I hear like Carl, the sentiments you share are often within the Sikh community too. So I very much sort of want to acknowledge that. When you're fearful, you're worried, sometimes looking like, what do I do to make this situation better right here, right now? And I think and so if I can reflect, probably in the last 3 years, I can tell you of at least in the state of California, at least, well, in the Bay Area, I can think of you 6 high-profile incidences where usually elderly men were attacked, and 1 case in 2019 now in Tracy, where an elderly man, although their family used to live in the Bay, but sort of they've been displaced into Tracy, where he was murdered just going for an evening walk. So these are issues very, very close to my heart. I reflect both what you're saying, but also what our young folks are saying. And I don't think what we have is enough conversations, to be frank, together, because in sometimes in our seeking in an immediate, desire to stop, that bleeding right now, may you also be doing more harm if we're also not listening to what our young folk are saying too. And I think what makes me a little bit uneasy, and you touched on it with the at least with the politics of the previous president, although I would kind of argue it's probably a little bit more systemic than that, is is the same people who have really made this such a toxic environment, is it those same people that are going to be the ones that help us? And that's what I'm just because many of the, and maybe because I just work with a lot of young folks, especially in parts of the Bay, and to be honest, especially in the Central Valley, where they do not see a lot of options for themselves. So a lot of Punjabi Sikh youth, especially young men, they go into the military, and I see when they come back, there's 2 very different routes. Some of them reflect on this and really talk about sometimes what a very negative environment in terms of how they were treated, how like what actually occurs in the barracks. And then I see those that very much kind of see that, look, I can be a junior partner to this white supremacy and sort of just go along sort of and hopefully kind of hitch my ride with that. And so like for me, I'm not talking less about political correctness. I don't even know sometimes even with these words. I definitely don't speak, and at least hearing at least Eddie, you know, Sammy, Carl, and even Evan, I don't think any of us are attempting to be politically correct or even whatever that means. But I think all of us are talking from our heart, and really that comes from our experiences. And so I guess that's where it just sits uneasy with me is the same like group that has created such a harmful, toxic environment. Is that the same group going to protect me? Is the same group going to protect my grandfather? Are they going to protect my grandma? Are they going to protect my mom? I just don't see it. I just don't see it.
Yeah. I think to share what feels like a pretty vulnerable personal anecdote. When I was growing up, I grew up in a very low income Filipino immigrant household, and didn't know, like I didn't have active consciousness around the fact that I grew up in a mixed status family, like a mixed immigration status family, until much later in life. And one of my first memories of policing was about driving in the car with my mom, who I later found out had been undocumented for most of her time in the United States, and seeing police pull up behind us. And my mom telling me, you have to hide now. You have to go into the back and hide. And at the time, I had no idea what that was about, but I learned very quickly that the police were something to be hidden from and to be fearful of, not supported by. And it was later in life that, you know, I made connections between the militarism of the Philippines that forced my mom to come to the United States in the first place, that connected it to the struggle she had as an undocumented person, that moved her to then be fearful of the police presence in the United States, even as ICE as the agency was just being created. Without knowing all of those specifics, I still learned the key lesson. And I hold that because I've seen a lot of folks in the chat really talking about, as we're creating solutions, how do we understand the root of what we're even coming up against? And I think a lot of people here have spoken to it, but I keep thinking about how the root of policing is around enforcement of laws created by people who actively did not see us as human, who actively did not see Black folks as full people, who actively contributed to the genocide of Native people. And police have been put in place to enforce that very regimen. And while I can really, really empathize and be in full compassion for people in my community who want policing due to protection, I want to dream bigger with them, right? Like I want to have more capacity for us to say, if the root of what we want is protection, how are we getting that? Because it has just been so apparent to me that police is not the thing that's actually protecting us. How are we building better community safety systems, like Eddie's saying? How are we building school and support and community safety systems so that what's thought of as crime or harassment or violence or racial tension is not even a tension in the first place? Yeah, and so I'm holding those complexities right now and thinking about my own personal story and really figuring out what is the root of the proactive thing that we want. Just as we're constructing and deconstructing the root of the violence, how can we be even more visionary in our dream with what happens in the short and in the long term?
Thank you for framing that and sharing the story, being vulnerable. I think for me, I agree with Carl. We have to work together, right? We have to find solutions together. But then we also, this is why, Carl, this is what I have shared this with you, but this is what I always share with people, right? Is that we must be willing to engage in a personal revolution before we're able to embark on a collective revolution. Because if you and I are not on the same page, then our idea of safety is going to be different, right? And if you and I are not on the same page, then, when I say you and I, I'm talking about figuratively, not you, but it's like we have to be on the same page, meaning that we have to humanize each other, right? And that humanization is rooted in our understanding and appreciative of each other's culture and history and our values, right? And so that's one aspect of it. So as we, as I share with you, I had inflicted harm. Well, my mom, my brother, and myself were at gunpoint, right? My mom was beaten and slapped and dragged, right, when she was in her mid-70s. And, they called the police. We called the police, right? Because there was no alternative. Because the system is saying that this is the only solution. It's called the police. Rely on the police. When we already know, right, again, is that had the police been effective, then they would be safe, right? And so when those, as myself being a perpetrator and a victim at the same time, for me, it's like I want more solution that's rooted in restorative justice. And yes, I want the whole personal accountable, people that we inflicted harm, just like I was held accountable in ways. But nobody's asking for systemic accountability to inflict those harm, right? And so now it's different because what Sammy was sharing earlier about reimagining what is possible. We have seen critical resistance always been working on the alternatives to 911, relying on more community mutual aid and people to find solutions. We have seen the recent passage of Assembly Bill 118, right? That is championed by many of the community-based organizations, as well as Senator Cindy Kamlager, right? That who, instead of calling the police on everything, that there's alternatives to 911, that actually investment, right, in community-based organization that has trust in the community to respond to some of those non-emergency, right, to alleviate some of those heavy burdening on the sole solution of law enforcement, right, which sometimes, again, through statistics, we know that when they respond to, they're not trained to respond to mental health crisis. They're not trained to respond to some of the conflict resolution that could be just disputed circles, restorative justice circles. So those are the reimagination, right? San Francisco did the same thing, right? Minnesota is calling for the same thing because all the what happened with continuous examples of George Floyd, right? The continued murdering of the indigenous people and people of color, and AAPI folks for that matter, right? And so I just want to finish by saying, we each, because of where we're standing, we all speak for some part of our community. So when I say, my community don't want to call for the police or don't want to have heavily invested in police, and your community wants to do that, that's why we're living in a contradiction, that we're always living in a contradiction. But our duty and responsibility is to how do we stay true to ourselves, stay true to our community, is that authentic true self that Nadeep was talking about, right? How we stay rooted to that, where we are able to really build racial solidarity not just saying that what my community wants, but it's what all of our community wants, right? Because that is the only way, is by building trustful relationships, loving our neighbors, to be able to really address systemic issues, that we can start the engagement of what is possible. I'm Eddie, I'm done speaking.
Thank you so much, Eddie. So we have about 3 minutes until breakout sessions end, but I want to go into a quick closing question. Before I do so, I'm going to ask everyone, including the audience, to please take a big breath. Right? Breathe in, breathe out. Yes, and firstly, just to echo, I want to thank you so much for taking on these questions, these difficult questions, and also for all of you who are showing up with vulnerability today. I think this is what bridging is really all about. So I love, if we can, this will be a bit of a quick round. I'm sad because I have so many questions for y'all, but an hour is just not enough to give to these questions. But I'd like to hear, we checked in before this conversation began on how you're feeling, in just one word, how you're feeling today. I would love to hear how you're feeling leaving this conversation. Maybe share one thing that you did learn, or something that surprised you or reshaped your perceptions. And it's a little bit of a lightning round. I apologize for that. But Carl, maybe let's start with you and go around.
This is a great learning experience, and it's good to have, having with all these wonderful panelists, and especially those joining us. And I'm so glad that there's so much we can learn from each other. And thank you. I'm so excited, and thanks again inviting me as one of the speakers. Thank you.
Deep, Eddie, Sammy, anyone jump in?
Urgent is the word. I feel the urgency. What I take away from this conversation is that we all have good intentions to make sure that we're not being fearful of being harmed. But sometimes good intentions yield bad results. And so I want all of us, what I take away is that I want all of us to continue to have this type of courageous conversations, and to agree to disagree, and to have that personal revolution all the time.
I think I'm leaving and invigorated. I think contemplative, because I think so many of the panelists raised extreme. I think, but invigorated by just being able to really kind of focus on our communities and hear so many people sort of dreaming bigger. I think there's a lot of intergenerational conversations that we need to have from settings, but I think the more that we have, the more we can share and really sort of dream what is the future of Bay Area.
I feel really grateful to everyone here for speaking and for listening, and just all the engagement. I think sometimes it's difficult to have these conversations, especially in a virtual space. So to be present with one another, I think is such a gift that I'm taking from this. And I feel hopeful that we will be able to do something together that is more visionary than the harm and violence that has come before us.
Thank you, Sammy. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, all of you. I'm so grateful to just hold space with you all, have this courageous conversation. And yeah, I'm bridging into practice. I think that's what we need to do. Our director of the Institute, Zhang, he said, we're all inherently connected and dependent on one another. And at least for me, this work, this needs to be done in order to gain a better standing on one another and hopefully join forces for good. In one way, at least the way I think we're all dependent on one another for survival. And if we don't connect, it puts our futures into question. And this is what needs to be done to keep our future sustained. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the conference. You can make your way over to the main stage. And panelists, thank you a million times over again for being here today. Appreciate it a lot.
All right, everybody.
All right. Ciao.